All right, everyone, we have to talk about early voting data. Now, keep in mind, this is a very, very limited set of data. It's a small proportion of all the total mail-in ballots. In some cases, we don't even have voter registration details. We can glean a few bits of information, which some are good for Trump and some are good for Biden, depending on the state, and we're going to be looking at that. As far as early voting totals, I do have several tabs open here, and I will be referring to them, actually, as well. And I do need actually to grab as well the actual national voting trends, again, insofar as we can actually see that here, because we need to look at these different states and so forth. We've got Minnesota, Arizona, Nevada, and so forth, and gleaning some potentially useful information. But keep in mind, you still have at least potentially another debate to go. That can change things. There will be polling shift in one direction or the other before voting day. We don't know what proportion of people are going to turn out in person. The general consensus is that Trump voters are more likely to vote in person. Poll after poll has shown there's a heavy favorability towards that among Trump voters. That being said, that could be a total fluke. It could turn out to go in the other direction. Anyway, the first thing I notice here, and there's a link in the description to the national polling, is that so far, insofar as they're tabulating, they're saying that there's over a 350% increase in people requesting ballots through the mail. That's significant. And as far as the numbers go, 47% of those people are Dems, 30% are Republicans. Now, if I match that up against the actual national total, Biden's at 52. He's way out ahead. Trump's struggling to hit 42. The thing is that if I look at those numbers, it would indicate that Trump is gaining enormous proportions of support from unaffiliated voters. Biden's votes are coming almost entirely from people that are already registered as Democrats. In a hyperpartisan election, this would not necessarily be good for Biden, especially when Trump's in-party enthusiasm is so high. If he's managing to get more than half of the unaffiliated voter base, he will presumably win. It might even be closer in the popular vote than it was in 2016. So that's technically good news for Trump. But keep in mind, some of these states aren't contributing registration data. That could skew it. This is only technically compiling 6 states for registration data. Now, 4 of them are very much in play. You get places like you got Arizona or Pennsylvania. That being said, it's just a sample. It's a skewed sample. I mean, it could be 5 points off for all we know. Then we look at Florida. The Florida polling, Biden is at 51 and Trump is at 40. Again, though, if you look at the registration data, Trump is 13 points behind. That is a massive oversampling of Democrats. Since Florida we know is virtually a 50-50 state, that would move the numbers significantly, and also, again, it would indicate that Trump is gaining most of the unaffiliated voters. This would comport to polling, which shows Trump up several points in most recent polls in Florida. I expect him to retain it most likely. Part of this is due to the Democrats moving far left, alienating the Cuban vote. And if turnout is high, Trump will win Florida. That, by the way, is the big prize of the night. Unless you assume Texas is in play, I tend to discount that fact. Then if we look at Michigan, this is bad news for Trump because the Republicans actually have a couple of points of additional registration, and yet Trump is 10 points behind. I think Trump should probably give Michigan up, to tell the truth. And I haven't been counting on him to necessarily retain it anyway. Much like with Arizona, there's a chance that it flips. Trump's biggest takeaway would be grabbing up Minnesota. If he can retain all the states that lean red anyway, like Ohio and Georgia, and manages to hold Florida, if he does flip that, he can literally lose Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona, and he still comes out ahead of 270. So it'd be a huge loss. Michigan has quite a few electoral votes. But I don't expect Trump to win, and this comports to polling. It shows Biden being a couple points behind his polling average, and that, by the way, is another big takeaway. It looks like Biden is slightly underperforming polls in samples that tend to skew towards the Democrats. Mail-in ballots tend to favor, this is the general consensus, the left, as opposed to Trump voters who are more likely to vote in person regardless of their partisan background. If you add on to that also an enthusiasm gap, Trump could come out 5-6 points ahead of his polling average. He could literally win the popular vote. I'm not counting on that being a high likelihood, but it's possible. But in Michigan, it wouldn't be enough. Even a 5-6 point swing wouldn't give him Michigan. I think Trump will lose that particular state based on the current metrics. Again, anything could change. Biden has an aneurysm, Trump, defeats Satan or something like that, drags him up out of hell and puts him on a pike or something. Things can happen, but it's just the preponderance of likelihood is not there. In North Carolina, Biden is 2 points ahead. Again, in a sample that doesn't give us registration data, so it means absolutely nothing. That would put him ahead of his polling, at least in some of the polls, and show Trump rising up higher. Again, in North Carolina, which has leaned at least slightly red recently, an enthusiasm gap plus a differential on actual election night gives Trump North Carolina. I think it's likely. Some states have moved towards the center, and other states are becoming more partisan. Like for instance, Nevada has becoming more blue over time. Colorado, some of those states, New Hampshire. Meanwhile, Ohio is moving back towards the center, feasibly. You have Georgia becoming more of a potential swing state in the future, and certainly North Carolina is almost a 50-50 shot. I expect a high degree of chance Trump retains North Carolina. In the state of Nevada, Trump is 6 points behind, but we don't really have any other meaningful data. We've only got a couple polls here, and it would show Biden arguably 3 or 4 points below his polling average. If that continues, I would expect Nevada could be in play. There's not a huge chance, but it's a toss-up state right now. And by the way, that's terrible for Joe Biden. If Trump does manage to pick it up, let's say Trump picks up Nevada and Minnesota. He can then lose 2 or 3 states, depending on which ones they are, and still come out ahead as long as Florida is not one of the states he loses. Pennsylvania is looking more likely to flip. Basically, the 2 states that Biden is most likely to flip are Michigan and Pennsylvania. The 2 states that Trump is most likely to flip, in my opinion, are Nevada and Minnesota, those 2. Trump's pickups would be considerably smaller, but if you pick up anything, that's always good news for your campaign, and the map won't look exactly the same as it did in 2016. You can see a trade-off. Trump wins by about the same margin, but the states are different, something like that. We look at Arizona. Trump is 2 points behind, but again, in registry data, you've got a 50-50 shot here. If it's 50-50, I would think that the turnout differential because of enthusiasm throws it back to Trump. If he's behind only by 2 points, if you have 50-50 data in registration, you have 50% Republicans, 50% Democrats, and then you have the unaffiliated voters splitting off barely for Joe Biden. In mail-in voting, again, the consensus, and this may be wrong, but it's echoed even by left-wing commentators, is that Trump voters are more likely to vote on Election Day. Therefore, even if the registration is different, it doesn't really make a difference. The sample would still be skewed. And then you have at least perceived enthusiasm gap, which is larger than 2016. Remember, the final result as compared to the final polling. In 2016, there was a 2.2% swing towards Trump over the polling. That was based on enthusiasm, the shy Trump vote, they called it, which it's really more about turnout than people hiding what their intent is. I think it will be larger this year. That would narrowly throw Arizona to Trump. However, it would make it considerably more of a swing state than it was in 2016. Biden would come a lot closer than Hillary Clinton, I think, and she lose by 5 points or something like that, if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong. And then we go to Minnesota. Again, this is a state that Trump would like to pick up. Unfortunately, again, we don't have registry data, so the fact that Biden's at 55 and Trump's at 43 could be a total statistical fluke. I don't know what to tell you with that one. As far as the polling goes, it's been very, very close for quite some time. It's diverged lately, with Trump's polling going down slightly. Over time, he's rebuilding that capability. But Biden has been statistically ahead for pretty much the entire race. It's just by an underwhelming margin. Keep in mind, though, Biden in some states here is definitely outperforming Hillary. It's just that in others, he's underperforming her. And it's just that we don't necessarily know that the early voting and mail-in ballots that have been received, other than a couple of the states, we don't even have data on who was registered Republican or Dem to compare that to the numbers we're seeing. And even then, not all of those votes are in. They're still tabulating them as we speak. Those numbers could look rapidly very different in a couple of days. And then again, you have the final debate. You have the possibility, when you have a 74-year-old overweight dude who's got coronavirus and a 78-year-old dude who's had several aneurysms and is visibly mentally deteriorating, you could have someone with a health issue. A vice president could croak too, feasibly. And Harris and Pence are no spring chickens, I suppose. And Harris definitely isn't mentally healthy. Just a little joke there. So this data can be meaningful. Some things look good for Trump, certainly in Florida. Certainly Biden is still hoping for Arizona. He's hoping to pick up Michigan, and that would be anomalous if he didn't, in my opinion. In other states, we don't have enough data. The problem is that people yesterday were tipping me off about that, and there was a 4chan thread and stuff, and they're saying, oh, well, it's terrible for Biden. Technically, yes. If you look at the national totals, just the national scattershot you're getting, Trump, statistically, if you were to adjust the sample to be more like the general population, even if you don't fix for any enthusiasm gap or anything like that, would favor Trump. Biden would be considerably below that 52. Trump would definitely be far higher than 41.4. It would be almost a 50-50 shot, and as Nate Silver himself has suggested, and he's no fan of Trump, at a photo finish election, it's advantage Trump is the incumbent. That being said, Lichtman disagrees. Many pundits do. I think more people are swinging for Biden than swung for Hillary, I think. They're expecting it to be more likely that Trump loses this time than they were in 2016, and even then the New York Times is like, well, there's a 99% chance that Trump loses. So keeping that in mind, at the moment I can't give a solid prediction. It's less sure that Trump is reelected than it was in 2016. That was a 99% chance of reelection. I've got him at 85% at the moment. Keep that in mind as well, and I'm not even hedging my bets. I'm expecting a 3-point enthusiasm gap. It keeps Arizona. It retains Florida. It gives him a shot of picking up Minnesota. It gives him apparently a shot at Nevada, which would be hysterical. It puts North Carolina out of Biden's reach, and that's the election, really. Because Biden could flip the remaining states, and he'd have to flip, I think, 5 different states just to be just over the margin. I don't think that's going to work, since there aren't 5 states to flip. He'd have to get the entire Rust Belt region, especially if he loses control of Minnesota. I don't think Ohio will be in play. I think that's a fluke. I think that's the idea of Ohio swinging, 10 points in a single election after a fairly long history of being more red. That would be the equivalent of Michigan going for Trump in 2016. The problem is that the candidate, Biden, doesn't really have, I think, the enthusiasm to pull that off. And I think that this anti-Trump vote will be ultimately weak showing up at the polls, because that doesn't generate enthusiasm as much as having a candidate you can rally behind and actually care about winning. Caring about the other dude losing is a bit weaker in my estimation. That's about all. Peace out.